Item number 5, deprioritizing of marijuana. Again, is the first of the first reading. And Maurice Jones, City Manager, will give us a background report.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You have before you a resolution and an alternative resolution pertaining to the use of marijuana and whether to ask the state government to revisit sentencing guidelines that result in jail time for personal use of marijuana, to eliminate the presumption of the intent to distribute marijuana without evidence, and to consider legislation that would decriminalize, legalize, or regulate marijuana. Proponents of the resolution believe that the time has come for careful consideration of these changes, and they believe a significant amount of time, energy, and money is used to arrest and prosecute marijuana users, not only in the state but also here in Charlottesville. And they believe that funding could be better used on other issues in our state and in our city. We'll touch on those issues in just a moment with Chief Longo. You've also heard from members of the public both in favor of and against this resolution, not only in these chambers over the course of the last month or so and this evening, but also via email. You've received a lot of email traffic over the course of the last week or so from folks who are both in favor and against these resolutions that you're considering before you this evening. They've raised concerns. Dr. Lillian Peek of the Health Department sent an email raising concerns about the effect of long-term marijuana use on children and adults. Dave Chapman from the Commonwealth Attorney's Office has raised those concerns as well with you via email. And in favor of the resolution, you've heard from Mr. Whitehead of the Rutherford Institute, who spoke in favor of the decriminalization aspect of this, but then also deprioritization. So, as we mentioned before, one of the reasons cited for approving the resolution this evening is the effect that marijuana enforcement has on the police department. There's an assumption that it has a major impact on the police department, and as the statistics demonstrate that we put in the memo for you, statistically speaking, it's a relatively small number of folks who are arrested for possession of marijuana, and Chief Longo is here to talk a little bit about those statistics and some of the other aspects of the law enforcement side of this. So, Chief Longo, can you come forward, please?
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Mayor, members of council, Mr. Brown, good evening. Thank you again for the opportunity to shed some light from a law enforcement perspective on this issue that you have in front of me. Let me say first and foremost, you've heard enough advocacy. I'm not here to advocate a position. I'm here to give you information to help you make a more informed decision. And as Mr. Fogel pointed out, my job is to balance the rule of law with the need to perform a legitimate law enforcement function. And in the midst of that balance is the community's expectation as to how we go about our work. I'm not going to disagree that in many places in this country, a lot of money is spent on the war on drugs. But right now we're talking about one small piece of that, and that's the possession of marijuana. And I gave you some data that I think would more than suggest the fact that we don't expend a lot of time, energy, or resources on enforcement of that law. Now, whether or not that's a conscious decision, it's the reality of the data. Our records management system is old, it's antiquated, and while it cannot tell you specific individual arrests, it can tell you how many charges are placed over a period of time. And in 2011, as the documentation would suggest to you, 5,040 criminal charges were placed. Only 113 of them were for possession of marijuana. And
Chief, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
Do you have a sense of how many of those were primary versus secondary?
Just about to get to that.
Okay.
Again, that antiquated records management system that will be replaced in the years to come, I hope, can't tell me that without looking at each individual case. Experience would suggest to me that most of those are likely secondary charges, meaning you're arrested for driving while under the influence or some other primary charge. We search you, incident to arrest, marijuana is discovered, and the marijuana charge is placed. When possession of marijuana is the primary charge, typically it's enforced by citation, not custodial arrest, which means there's no time for the officer to be out of service. There's no time to spend at the complex visiting with the magistrate. They issue the citation, much like they do a traffic citation, and they're on their way. And then the person comes to appear in general district court somewhere down the road. And as Mr. Chapman would say if he were here, and I certainly can't speak for him, the vast majority of those cases don't see jail time. There are other alternatives in this community that people are afforded. Drug court, for example. Tom Von Hemert, our community criminal justice planner, is here to talk about some data to the extent you have questions. Ross Carew from Offender Aid and Restoration is here to talk about their clients' that have been exposed to these charges, the marijuana subpopulation. So statistically, I don't think we have an argument here that it's taxing the resources of law enforcement. There's one thing I will bring to your attention, and I'll simply ask you to consider, and I won't only ask you to consider it as a police chief, I'll ask you to consider it as a parent of a 12 and 14-year-old in our school divisions. The Partnership for Drug-Free America published a report that was released just last week. It had some dramatic statistics about the increase in drug use, marijuana use specifically, among young people. The preceding month before this study came out, the numbers went up over 80% over a 3-year period. And I want to read to you very briefly, and then I'll sit down and let others talk, what the president of the partnership had to say about the report. These findings are deeply disturbing, as the increases we're seeing in heavy, regular marijuana use among high school students can spell real trouble for these teens later on. Heavy use of marijuana, particularly beginning in adolescence, brings the risk of serious problems, and our data show it is linked with alcohol and other drugs as well. Kids who begin using drugs or alcohol as teenagers are more likely to struggle with substance use disorders when compared to those who start using after their teenage years. Now, I'm not a subject matter expert in this area, but I am a parent, and I am concerned that this data may in fact speak to the very things the president of the organization speaks to in his comments. So I would ask you to consider that, and to talk to others that are more skilled in that area than I am before you make a decision. And so if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. As I said, Tom and Ross are here to talk about some of the data that's in the report as well. That is the memo that we provided you with.
Okay. Is somebody going to present new data?
Good evening. I'm Tom Van Hemert. I work for you. I work as the criminal justice planner, and I also work as the coordinator for CIT, Crisis Intervention Team. If I can answer any questions in reference to the statistical information that I was able to gather from the different agencies that are within our community, I'd be glad to answer them.
I do have a quick question. That the National Association of Drug Courts were opposed to decriminalization.
Correct.
Yeah, and do you have any of their rationale for that decision?
I called Region 10, the CSB, which provides the treatment for the drug court clients, and what I listened to from Linda Hamilton, who's the outreach director for substance abuse and mental health, was saying that the clients that are dealing with addictions are probably one of the high risk for reoffense, but it's also one of the issues of what's called amotivational, as in that they would rather deal with other drugs and not dealing with the addiction of marijuana itself. So it's easier sometimes for them to give up the use of other illegal substances or even alcohol, but for the use of marijuana, that's a very hard substance in their history in process to give up compared to any of the other drugs that they're dealing with in their recovery process.
Oh, okay.
I have a question. I got some data from the jail, which is not at all official, and also dealing with the how you track what people are charged with and what they're in jail for. And,
sure.
But they were looking at people who had marijuana, either possession or possession with an intent to distribute, so larger quantities of possession, as their primary charge. And so presumably there's some likelihood that other charges were lesser charges, which seemed to be one way of getting at it, not so much a statistically significant way, but a reasonable way to look at it.
Sure.
And in kind of a cursory looking over it, found maybe 20, 21 folks in a year from Charlottesville who were actually in jail on these charges.
Correct.
And one of the things that I found particularly disturbing was that of those folks who were in jail, they were 4 times as likely to be African American as white. And so, that really kind of makes me wonder, how is it decided who goes to jail, and how are we enforcing this when we talk about that it's already not a huge sender of people to jail? it seems that when people are sent to jail, there's an incredible racial disparity, way more than the jail population itself. And I just wondered if you have any insight into that.
No, you asked the right question, and I agree with Mr. Fogel. I think that a lot more research has to be done within the data systems. And unfortunately, we work with an antiquated system, and we can't compare one system with the other systems in the criminal justice system. And that's part of my work with the evidence-based decision-making model, is to take a look at those issues so we can answer those types of questions. You know, is it a race issue, or is it other complicated factors? Whether it could be poverty, it could be different kinds of drug use that is happening, where it might be cocaine or crack or heroin or meth.
Well, this was all among the people who had marijuana as their primary charge.
Right. So we have to take a look at the total numbers and how it's all combined together. So you're right, but the information or the data to support that one way or the other is not there at this time. Chief Longo, do you want to answer?
The only thing I was going to add, and you are asking the right questions, and as I was alluding to with respect to our records management system, we're in the process of letting an RFP to identify, as the region that is, to identify someone to help craft an RFP to get a new system. And one of the things we're going to be looking to is what are the questions we need to ask of that system? For example, I want to be able to break out primary versus secondary charges. I want to be able to know arrests, not specific, a number of arrests, but not just specific charges. I want to be able to look at race and gender and ethnicity and other factors as well when we pull out data and begin making decisions from that data. So again, the right question is just we're not in a position to be able to answer it with any clarity based on the data that we have. It's just as frustrating to us as it is to you and the rest of the community, particularly on such an important issue such as disproportionate minority representation.
Chief Longo, do you have any other staff member who wishes to speak?
If with your indulgence, I would ask Ross Carew to speak specifically to the issue of recidivism, because part of the conclusions in the memo that staff provided, that there was this data that demonstrated that they reoffended at a higher rate, second only to domestic violence, and I thought that would be information council might find useful in making a decision.
Good evening. Ross Carew, I'm the Assistant Director at OAR. And what typically happens in a possession of marijuana case, the client is given two different options when they go to court. They're offered what's called a deferred judgment, in which they have a 6-month suspension of their license. They have to come to our program. They have to go to ASAP for drug education. When they come to our office, they're under supervision, and they have to do urine screens. So the other option is that they be found guilty of the offense, and generally what happens is they're given a 30-day suspended sentence. That's typically what happens. Now, when we looked at data in two different ways, we looked at it across the state, which all of our sister agencies, and found that the possession of marijuana caseload was approximately 20% of the statewide caseload. We also did some recidivism work, and we also did some risk assessment work. In looking at the risk assessment work, we determined that folks that have been convicted of or given that deferred judgment of possession of marijuana were second only to domestic violence in terms of risk for general recidivism. We also looked at recidivism here in Charlotte, for OAR, and found that, we looked at our entire population, and then we looked at 3 different subpopulations of ours: domestic violence, underage alcohol, and possession of marijuana. We found that the possession of marijuana population had a reconviction rate after 3 years of 42%, and a 3-year reconviction rate of substance abuse related offenses at 25%. So that's concerning. Question.
Are we talking about somebody who you find a joint? I mean, there's got to be a big spectrum here of people who get caught with marijuana.
Yeah, there's legal legal classifications based on how much you have. If you have over X amount, I'm sure the chief can talk to you about what that X amount is. It can be graduated penalties.
And charges.
or charges, excuse me, on felony versus misdemeanor. If it's just simple possession, it's a misdemeanor offense.
And those misdemeanor offenses they have those two choices of guilty or you have to go to drug court? I mean, isn't that kind of...
No, ma'am. What'll happen is they'll come to our program, OAR, for supervision, probation supervision for a 6-month period of time. They'll also go to ASAP, in which they'll have a drug education class. They'll also get urine screened, and they'll have their driver's license restricted.
Even for a tiny bit of marijuana? Is this what we're talking about?
Yes, ma'am. Any amount.
Any other questions from the gentleman?
And I have a question of Chief Longo. In terms of maybe you have data, maybe you just have experience, and I trust both of them. In terms of sort of street crime, mm-hmm. Do you see much street crime associated with marijuana?
Well, certainly distribution of any drugs typically results in other criminal behaviors. Sometimes that criminal behavior is violent. Simple possession of marijuana, I don't know that I necessarily have enough data in which to determine whether there's a greater likelihood that that person would be involved in other types of crime. Not so much with possession. And again, it's a small subpopulation of charges that we've... And that 113, by the way, is, if we look back over 5 years, is about the average. Typically don't go much beyond that. I think the highest at one point in time may have been around 130. But they're not huge numbers.
Right. And I think you told us this, and maybe you could repeat it for, since I can't remember, and for the audience. If there's 113, is there a majority just, again, have a small amount that you kind of suspect, or they're just kind of just using themselves?
Without looking at each of those 113 cases specifically, it would be difficult for me to be able to make that determination.
Okay. I think, personally, I think this sort of speaks to one of the problems is that there is a big difference between just having a little recreational cannabis and distributing. I mean, and really, being in the black market of drug distribution, and the penalty seems kind of severe for just a little bit.
Well, I think that would be, those thoughts would be relevant if in fact the discussion was about whether we're decriminalizing or legalizing marijuana, but that's not the discussion before us tonight. It's how much big of a priority should law enforcement place on it, and I think the numbers speak to that.
Right, but I think at the same time, the reason it's come up is that people's lives are really seriously impacted for a very small amount of a drug that a lot of people do imbibe in every once in a while. So I think that's really kind of where we're trying to get to. Not people who are distributing, not people who are driving under the influence, and certainly not talking about children. But I think that actually does speak to one of the issues, is the penalty really, so outweigh what the crime is?
Well, I'm certainly not trying to provide direction to counsel by the following comment, but it sounds to me like some information that you might need to look at and gather before making a decision is information regarding prosecution and sentencing, so that you have a firm idea of just how many of these 113 people are actually going to our regional jail and spending time there. Because I don't have that information.
About
right,
21.
But still, the 6 months is still, that sort of 6 month obligation still seems just like a,
I just said about 21.
If those are accurate.
That are simple possession charges, because you have mentioned possession with intent to distribute and possession.
Yes, but not distribution.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Chief, question for you. There's,
yes,
as you know, there's two versions of the resolution that are before council tonight. They're largely identical, and I think both properly focus on the need to change state law and change state sentencing guidelines, et cetera, which is really, as you say, that's really where the attention should be. But they do differ somewhat in terms of the kind of statement we make about local enforcement. And one version essentially says that we believe it should be a low priority, and so does the police department, because they're not currently treating it as a terribly high priority. And I'm paraphrasing the language. And does that language give you any heartburn? I mean,
I don't think there's anything about the resolution that excuse me, that handcuffs law enforcement in doing our job and carrying out our lawful duties and responsibilities. The message that is sent is really of what's most concerned to me, and I spoke to that particularly with our young people. I don't want to ever send the message that this is okay. Mm-hmm. It's not that big of a deal. It's just marijuana, because I think that has adverse consequences with respect to kids. Having said that, and again, I don't know that the numbers are necessarily a conscious deprioritization of a possession of marijuana arrests. It just happens to be our energy is focused on much more serious things, particularly violent crime in our community. That's how we deploy our resources.
Any other questions for the staff?
I have no more questions. I have
So
comments,
we
but
don't have
no
public
questions.
hearing, so you have to wait till after the meeting, okay? Any questions?
Any discussion?
Okay. Let's
you,
move
Mr.
to
Mayor.
discussion.
Thank you.
And comments by the city council members? Who would like to start?
I don't have a whole lot to say, I guess. I actually am generally supportive of decriminalization, not because I support use of marijuana or because I don't think it's addictive, because I think in some people it's addictive and in some people it's not. Just like alcohol, some people can recreationally drink alcohol and some people can't. And cigarettes as well, although I can't imagine not becoming addicted to cigarettes. But I think that decriminalization has more to do with regulation and with control than it does with saying it's okay. But I do have a little concern about this resolution. So the last paragraph of it I don't have any problem with, which is asking the state to revisit that at a state level. My concern is that absent decriminalization, we don't have control. We don't have ways of, sort of regulating and checking for quality and all of the things that you have when you have legalization. And so, I came in here today, and I'm still kind of here, a proponent, or at least an advocate for decriminalization, but I'm not sure that the local level resolution absent decriminalization really gets at what I want, which is a continued, keeping people from using marijuana for the most part. I think that, if people choose to get drunk on a weekend, that's their business. But I don't drink, and I don't really think it's a healthy thing to do. I don't think that society should be saying, hey, it's just alcohol. It's just, go ahead and drink, and then if you drive, well, yeah, you could kill somebody. But so I guess that I'm really torn on this, because I think that I worry that with too much of the sort of like wink wink and we're not really going to enforce it, we end up with a possibility for more racial disparity. I think we end up with people kind of who are in more public settings ending up caught more, probably students caught less. So I really wanted to go first so that the rest of you can kind of give it your best shot, and I'll listen from now on.
And I hope you bear with me, because this has been a cause of some heartburn and sleepless nights as well. For the record, I am the mother of two sons, one who's 20, almost to be 21, and one who's 16. So I'm very aware of what our children are seeing and facing day to day. So I'm looking at what the charge is at hand, which is discussing this resolution about deprioritizing marijuana. So when I look at that, I look at the resolution language, and I find, quite honestly, a lot of the claims misleading. And I'm going to be going down point by point. There's the whereas that Virginia made 19,000 related arrests in 2009, and that the taxpayers are burdened annually, and that the cost of the resultant prosecutions, supervisions, and incarcerations are a real burden. And however, we've just heard that in Charlottesville, only 2.2% of local charges in Charlottesville are related to marijuana possession. So that's the 115 out of 5,000. That's 2.2%. So this is, in fact, in practice, subordinate to other criminal charges. The possession of marijuana is typically then dealt with by an issuance of a Virginia uniform summons as opposed to a custodial arrest. So again, it is not this burden that was projected in this resolution. Secondly, the resolution talks about how scientific and medical studies have repeatedly found that any effect marijuana has on users and those around them is significantly more benign than alcohol. It also says that adverse effects of marijuana are greatly overshadowed by the adverse effects of current Virginia marijuana laws and penalties. So those are pretty big statements to make that haven't been substantiated. And I look at what Dr. Peek has offered us by way of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the science of drug abuse and addiction, and it talks about that there is definite evidence that links marijuana use and schizophrenia. Again, I ask that there be respect shown in the chambers. It has also been shown, this is from Dr. Lillian Peek. She is our director of public health services. It increases heart rate, 4.8-fold increase in the risk of heart attack in the first hour of smoking. It contains 50 to 70% more carcinogenic hydrocarbons than tobacco smoke. That means that the lungs, when they're given to prolonged exposure, are more harmed by this use. A study of 450 individuals found that people who smoke pot have more health problems and miss more days of work than non-smokers. It relates to increased absences, tardiness, accidents, workers' compensation claims, and job turnover. We've also heard from Chief Longo that the evidence of decriminalization or legalizing marijuana may well have an impact on both mental and public health resources. So again, from a mental public health resource, there are serious concerns with this chemical. It is a chemical being ingested that affects the mind. And it affects young minds in particular. From the criminal justice perspective, I looked at Jeff Gould, the drug court administrator. The drug court clients and the National Association of Drug Courts is in opposition to decriminalization. Chief Longo has already stated that the Charlottesville Police Department has done exactly what this resolution is requesting, and by way of deprioritizing. It uses its funds for other higher priority crimes in the city. From our Commonwealth's attorney, Dave Chapman, he cites the February 2006 report, The Mental Health Risks of Adolescent Cannabis Use. It has adverse health effects on children. And so, and just recently there was an article in the Washington Post about the, I guess it's called fake pot, that is also an herb that is coated with THC, that is legal in D.C., and it has increased, its use has been increasing among young people very rapidly. And then again, from studies cited by Dr. Peek, the effect on the developing adolescent mind cannot be ignored. So I do have to think very seriously that when our district health director and our Commonwealth's attorney have clearly demonstrated via peer-reviewed studies that there are harmful mental and physical health effects on prolonged marijuana use on youth, this does directly refute several of the conditions laid out in the resolution. Our police chief and our Commonwealth's attorney have demonstrated that marijuana use is already receiving secondary emphasis as a law enforcement priority. Again, this directly refutes a fundamental premise of this resolution. So what's the purpose of this resolution? Given that its fundamental premises seem flawed to me, its purpose can only be symbolic. That means the council is being used as a bully pulpit to promote a particular message to the community. And I can't help but ask, what is that message? That marijuana use is benign and that our laws, which are based on false premises, should be ignored? What does this say to our middle school and high schoolers? That marijuana use is benign and that our laws, which are based on false premises, should be ignored? What position will that put our police, teachers, principals, and yes, parents who are desperately trying to keep our youth motivated and focused on achievement so that they can find good careers and trades? What does that say to their prospective employers? So I honestly cannot think that this bully pulpit can be used to send such mixed messages to our children. So what should the message be to our children? Find out what you need to do as a career as an adult, what you love to do, develop your talents, learn, know the feeling of failure and success, go to college, become a skilled craftsman, run a business. So what should the council's job be? To facilitate those opportunities, to reduce that 18% unemployment between ages 18 to 30 of our population. When people feel that they have a reason for being and that they have a destiny, then there's no need to self-medicate. There's no need to get involved with something that you're going to regret that you got involved with later on. And again, the addiction rate among the 13, 14-year-olds, it's so much higher when the kids get involved with it. And this message that we could potentially be sending with this resolution is quite startling to me, to our youth. So I cannot support this resolution.
Actually, for many of the same reasons, I do support the resolution because I believe, it's ironic that we hear a lot of statistics about all of these people using marijuana when it's illegal. It's sort of found on every corner, on every street corner. It's in the black market. If it actually were legal and it was regulated, then we would have much more control. You could argue at least we would have much more control about how kids would have access to it. At this point, we don't. We have no control because it's on the black market. I have sympathies with what Ms. Roberts said, but it's because it's illegal that you've got people going in and out of the house. If it was legal, you wouldn't see that with the distribution of marijuana. And I think it's largely, I do believe that it's largely because it's legal that we're having a lot of these problems. Not that we won't not have them, because we do with alcohol and we do with tobacco. Those are also both addictive drugs, if you will. It's not that you get rid of all your problems, but you just have so much more control over how they're distributed. And so I think the resolution doesn't, obviously we don't have the power to decriminalize marijuana, but I think it does, send the message actually in support of those who can work to decriminalize marijuana, that we, along with, quite frankly, the majority of Americans, feel it's time. We have lost this war on drugs. We've lost it. And the longer we continue to pretend that we can fight it while it's illegal, the more money, the more deaths, the more worldwide, because every time somebody smokes that stuff, they're supporting the illegal marketing and black market in this drug. So I think we should legalize it, and I think we should send that message.
Doris?
I wanted to read a quote. Political leaders and public figures should have the courage to articulate publicly what many of them acknowledge privately, that the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that repressive strategies will not solve the drug problem, and that the war on drugs has not and cannot be won. Instead of punishing users who do no harm to others, governments should end criminalization of drug use, experiment with legal models that would undermine organized crime syndicates, and offer health and treatment services for drug users in need. We need drug policies based on methods empirically proven to reduce crime, lead to better health, and promote economic and social development. Now, people have said, some of the opponents of this resolution have tried to malign it by dragging some individuals' past history through the mud as a way of discrediting this message. But let me tell you who issued that quote that I just read. It was former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz, who served Ronald Reagan in the White House, former U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, the former presidents of Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, United Kingdom business mogul Richard Branson, and the current Prime Minister of Greece. All right, this isn't a bunch of potheads sitting around a table coming up with some radical language. This was a 19-member commission. It was called the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which I think pointed out what a lot of, pointed out or communicated a perspective which now it seems the majority of Americans support, which is that we have been headed the wrong direction when it comes to drug policy, and actually treating it the way that we do is actually making the problem worse. And I don't think any of us up here are champions for marijuana. Let me just say that I've never once partaken, and I never intend to partake in it. But I don't. Let me tell you a little story. All right. A number of years ago, my uncle was dying of cancer. His body was riddled with tumors, and in his last weeks, he could not find comfort from any of the medications that he had available to him. And he asked my grandmother, his mother, if she could find somebody that could get him some marijuana to help him deal with the pain that he was suffering. And she was a little worried, obviously, about trying to score some dope for her dying son, because she didn't want to end up going to jail. But she did it for him, and thank God that he did have access to one drug in the last days of his life that did help him relieve his pain. And I'm just wondering, how many of the folks in this room, I mean, what do you think the appropriate punishment should have been, particularly for those who feel like we're on the right track in terms of how we deal with drugs? What would be the appropriate punishment for my grandmother and my uncle? I mean, should they have... I mean, is that a 10-year? It's a rhetorical question. Is it a 10-year jail sentence? Is it a 5-year? Is it a fine? I mean, what's the appropriate punishment? It's all right. Maybe I shouldn't have opened up. But my point is that, in my opinion, the appropriate punishment was no punishment. And yet, the society that we're in right now, even though 80% of Americans think that marijuana should be legalized for medicinal purposes, and now 50% should believe it should be legalized in general, we still treat it as an offense which can ruin people's lives. And I think one of the speakers earlier made a very important distinction, and I think it was the woman in green, and I'm blanking on your name right now, but when you said that we have to distinguish between dangerous drugs and non-dangerous drugs. The fact is that marijuana, again, I don't encourage people to use it, but the fact is that it's a much less dangerous drug than alcohol. And in my opinion, sometimes we have to take sort of the 30,000-foot view and think just objectively. Just think objectively. If we had the opportunity to start from scratch and come up with a drug policy that was consistent, and that really did achieve the objective of regulating the dangerous drugs, or outlawing the dangerous drugs, and regulating the less dangerous drugs, I think we'd come up with a much more sensible policy when it comes to marijuana. This resolution, either versions of this resolution, do not make marijuana legal in the city of Charlottesville. And I want to be very clear about that. And we're not being asked to make marijuana legal in the city of Charlottesville. We're being asked to make a statement about whether or not arresting people or prosecuting people or persecuting people for small-scale personal use of marijuana should be a priority, and it's clearly not a priority as it is now. And I have no problem with us going on record as in support of that notion that there are much higher priorities. Just last week, the President of the United States, Mr. Barack Obama, said these words: I can't nullify congressional law. I can't ask, and this has to do with medicinal marijuana, I can't ask the Justice Department to say, ignore completely a federal law that's on the books. What I can say is, use your prosecutorial discretion and properly prioritize your resources to go after things that are really doing folks damage. As a consequence, there haven't been prosecutions of users of marijuana for medical purposes. That's essentially what this resolution is asking us to do. It's the very same notion that to properly prioritize our resources. I think the focus really needs to be, our primary focus needs to be on changing the law. But in the meantime, I think it's perfectly legitimate for us to say, as an elected body, that there are higher priorities, and that and that we're on the wrong direction when it comes to the war on drugs. And so I'll leave it at that.
We are considering tonight, as Councilman Norris said, marijuana enforcement priority, and not whether it's legal or not illegal. This resolution deals with the priority issue for our police department. We have received a great deal of information in the last few weeks. Many experts on both sides, and I appreciate that information. I have read everything I have gotten so far. I would focus on at least 3 experts on this issue, which are local experts, which police department, Commonwealth Attorney, and our health department. I think you already heard what Chief Longo has said, that those charged with possession of marijuana are at medium to high risk for re-offending, are at high risk for being convicted of other charges, have a lower probation success rate. It is his viewpoint. Commonwealth Attorney also has said that especially for youth, marijuana in early years can result in substance addiction, life problems, as well as criminal behaviors. Our health department, Kathy just mentioned and pointed out that some long-term use can result into addiction, especially for youth. It is associated with anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia. High doses can produce acute psychosis. Marijuana smoke contains carcinogens 50 to 70% more than tobacco. It has increased the heart rate and heart attack problems. These are 3 viewpoints, at least local viewpoints, which I think one ought not to ignore. More importantly, what kind of message we're trying to send to our citizens, to our children. Not just the facts that marijuana is harmful, but also, is it the fact you're trying to convey to them? It is okay to smoke marijuana? Is that the message you're trying to convey by this kind of resolution? It seems to me that's what you're implying. Are you trying to say enforce and follow only the laws which you like and disregard the others? I think that's what you're trying to say in my mind. I think it is a passing of such a resolution showing our priority will detract from the community health, safety, and welfare of our citizens. That's why I plan to vote against it. We all have some chance. If you'd like to speak more, I'll be happy to hear from you.
I would like to say that I feel like we have 3 counselors who support the final paragraph of this, asking the state General Assembly and the governor to revisit the sentencing guidelines that merit jail terms for simple possession, do away with rules that support pose to intent to distribute without evidence, and give due consideration to sponsored state bills that would decriminalize, legalize, or regulate marijuana like alcohol. And I would be comfortable with a resolution that was that. I'm also intrigued by Mr. Fogel's proposal. I don't think that it's something we've had given any due diligence to and could vote on tonight, but would think that that might be something that I would want to at least look at. I've just kind of glanced through it to see if that's something that I would be more comfortable with. But I really do feel that in the absence of decriminalization, that especially the whereases I have a problem with, but even the first paragraph of the now therefore let it be resolved, that as long as it does continue to be illegal and the only way to get it is from drug dealers and there is no control or way of regulating its quality or any of the things that we would have if we did have decriminalization, I'm not prepared to vote yes on that part tonight.
Other comments or questions?
I'd just like to read a paragraph, maybe two, from a letter we got today from someone. I thought it was such a good letter, and I'm going to start in the middle, but she writes, as a single mother and a business owner who has worked in the field of education for over 35 years, I fully support this resolution. When it comes to the message that passing this resolution could send our children, I think it is more important to focus on what are we teaching our children by continuing to participate in a failed war against drugs, because the statistics show that we are also failing to keep them off drugs. It is important to impart to our youth there are many times in life when maturity and a sense of responsibility should be acquired before engaging in certain activities. Driving, voting, serving in the military, and the use of alcohol and tobacco are just a few examples. And she goes on to talk about truthful conversations with our children so that they can make the best possible choices for their futures. And, I think it's a really good point. It goes on, it's a lovely piece, really about this issue being just one of many issues as we raise our children that we need to be talking to them about. And
I found that letter also very compelling. I think those are very good arguments.
Yeah.
Is there a motion on the floor? Anybody would like to make a motion?
Could you repeat the motion? Kristen, was yours?
Well, I would support a motion that we just do the final paragraph. I don't know, do you need whereases for a resolution? I don't think you do. I mean, if we feel that that decriminalization is something that we can agree is something that we would like the General Assembly to support or to revisit, that part I feel very comfortable with. Because I think it would take marijuana use out of the criminal field and put it in more of a public health field, and I think that that's appropriate. But
what kind of message are you sending to the children as that it is okay to use marijuana?
Not at all.
I'm wondering if you're suggesting that we should make alcohol illegal because keeping it legal sends the message that we're telling children to drink alcohol.
We are talking about marijuana
once,
today.
didn't we?
That's my point. We tried it once. It was a miserable failure.
And I think that the people who wanted it to be made illegal were concerned about the fact that people were drinking and abandoning their children, people were drinking and getting involved in fights, that it was very bad for them. And it's true, it is. And I think that the fact that it was criminalized did not help, which is why I'm for decriminalization.
So I appreciate your willingness to support that last paragraph, because I think at the end of the day that's really the most important, practically speaking, the most important piece of the resolution. I do want to put in one more plug, if nothing else, at least to honor and recognize the fact that recognize and honor what we've already heard from our police department, which is enforcement of the marijuana laws is actually not currently a high priority for the Charlottesville Police Department, and there was some alternative language suggested as a second part of the resolution that essentially just says we support the current policy. I mean, we don't believe it should be a high law enforcement priority in the city.
And I don't see any reason to do a resolution saying, I mean, we could do resolutions supporting all the laws we approve of, or the practices that we approve of, and I don't think we do that.
I could live with that. You don't want all those whereases, and then just take that one?
Because I agree with Councilor Galvin, some of the whereases are problematic, and I think that you don't really need these particular whereases to support that final paragraph. If we wanted to put in new whereases, that we could, but I don't know that we need to.
So is there a
May I
motion on
ask
the
a
floor?
question of Mr. Von Hemert?
Sure.
Do you mind if, since this is becoming a situation, and we've talked about this before with regards to the legislative liaison with the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission, and how David Blount in that capacity serves as the person that would look at this, gather information from the members of the commission region, and they form their issues. It's just a package, a legislative package, a request to look into. It's not a resolution that is projecting a symbolic message. It is just a package to look into more research about this issue or that issue. Is that something that would be possible from your perspective as the community criminal justice planner?
Can I just ask for a clarification that most of that legislative packet is made up from resolutions that we do? That's where they come from.
Well, maybe, but it's interesting that that's not how it's been presented to me, so that's news to me, so that's interesting. Because then, if this was simply a question of doing research where we did look at the implications of mental health and the implications upon youth behaviors, where we did look seriously at other communities and countries, including other states that are now backpedaling on a lot of their legislation, amending their decriminalization laws, if we could do research that looked seriously at all of the ramifications, I would be in support of a request to have further research done at the legislative level. But I cannot support a resolution that is already come to the conclusion that this is what we must do.
So the wording, I'm sorry, go ahead and answer, then I'll jump in.
Sure. You know, I have to compliment the city of Charlottesville and the county of Albemarle. You're one of 7 national sites that received an award for being your criminal justice system based on evidence. And we're the only locality east of the Mississippi that received that award. And the reason why we got that award was based on doing the work on all perspectives, both from the criminal justice system, from the mental health systems, from substance abuse. And when you're talking about marijuana, there's a whole component of that you're looking at. I mean, you can look at municipal use, and I absolutely support that. My wife works as a hospice social worker, and so I understand the need for pain medication for that, and that's an absolute priority that's needed in that factor. There's also the factors that you're dealing with drug wards on a national basis, which we're not talking about in this resolution. So yes, you know, my suggestion would be to follow up with your history that you've done, whether when you developed a drug court or when you developed a CIT project, that you took almost a year on either one of those on just doing the research and the evidence before you made that decision. So I would follow that same guideline that has gotten you that national status already of doing the research, from looking on how it affects from all different perspectives, because whether you're talking about municipal use, which has a completely different THC level compared to what might be out on the street, compared to somebody that grows it for their own use, those are completely different animals in the system. So you're absolutely right. There's a tremendous amount of research that needs to be done when you're looking at that, whether you're looking at it at a global level or looking at it just what's happening here in Charlottesville. And you can add all those different perspectives, whether it's the racial issues or the issues on that you brought up about folks or inmates that are in jail based on race. So we can take a look at that information if you'd like to, and we can provide more detailed analysis for you. But again, with the history that we had, it took us a year before we developed those national recognized programs that we have today. So I'll take your lead on how you would like us to follow.
One of the things that I appreciated about the language of this last paragraph is that it doesn't say that we demand that the Virginia General Assembly and the Governor of Virginia decriminalize marijuana. It says that we ask that they revisit sentencing guidelines, do away with rules that suppose intent without evidence, give due consideration to sponsored state bills that would decriminalize, legal, or regulate. So it's really exactly what you're calling for, it sounds like.
Well,
at a state level.
On a state level. And so you have to take it at all different levels, and because you can't just put it into one component.
But I'm not sure that we need to do all of that research before we ask the state to do that research. I think that you're right. Before we considered Mr. Fogel's or this other stuff, that there's more information that we need.
You're exactly right. I mean, you've come full circle here, is that it's a federal and a state mandate, and it has absolutely no bearing on any municipality or locality. So it really comes down to perception of what you want to have your locality look at. And so and that goes in both directions. You're absolutely right. So you need to look at both sides. I agree.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion that the City Council call on the Virginia General Assembly and the Governor of Virginia to revisit the sentencing guidelines that merit jail terms for simple possession, do away with rules that suppose intent to distribute without evidence, and give due consideration to sponsored state bills that would decriminalize, legalize, or regulate marijuana like alcohol.
I would second that.
Is there discussion?
Discussion.
I would just like to point out that you actually made a very good point, which is where I think regulation would be really critically important, and that is that we're not, this marijuana over here isn't the same as this marijuana over here. It isn't the same as this marijuana over here in terms of THC, and that is where legalization would be incredibly helpful, I think.
More discussion on the motion?
I would still want to insist that we qualify that and make it absolutely clear that we are not condoning, sanctioning, telegraphing in any way that marijuana use is not harmless. And I cannot even make this statement or agree to this statement without without some qualifier. And at the same time, I'm beginning to feel like this isn't a local ordinance. We are been spending a lot of time talking about state and federal law. If this is something that the state would already be looking at, researching, we would benefit from and contribute to, fine, as long as it's not additional staff time on our part. This is not something we should be spending local time doing. So what I'm as we're noodling around with this and we're trying to tweak it so that more of us could agree to it, I'm seeing that it's going to wind up taking a lot more time. And
how about if it said, let it be resolved that while use of any quantity of marijuana for whatever purpose is and will continue to be illegal in the city of Charlottesville, the City Council calls on the Virginia General Assembly, etc., to add that preamble. I'm not in a position where I can even say that we would do away with rules of any kind. I'm in agreement, and I've always been, the very first statement when this issue came up would be to look at the sentencing guidelines for jail terms for simple possession. That was the one thing that I had always said I would be interested in looking at. Which is what this is, that we need a little more time on.
Yeah, we need more time on that. And but what instead we've been getting is this, what quite frankly feels like a polemic to me.
Well, let me...
So I think maybe this is just not going to work tonight.
We do have a motion, and if you can agree on it, fine. If not, maybe we can follow up on Mr. Fogel's suggestion, which he gave to us.
May I offer a friendly amendment?
Yes, ma'am.
That we add that at the beginning?
Because
it was...
but that does exactly what you said a few minutes ago you didn't want to do, which is this restate existing policy. I mean, I think just leaving it clean and simple, as you initially suggested.
Okay.
Because it doesn't sound like it's going to win us.
Would you vote against it no matter what?
I think
even if that were added?
I need more time to look at Mr. Fogel's I am concerned about the way we do our sentencing and jail time, yes, but this has gotten all too wrapped up with too many other messages.
This is basically adding to our legislative agenda, which is something that we do about a lot of things.
I would not be willing to agree today, at least.
Okay. We have a motion and we have a second.
Yes. Any more discussion on the motion? If not, please vote. Motion passes. 3-2. Okay, we have